In the last episode of Project Pass, we began our journey through the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans, Louisiana, and we saw some incredible pieces, like this piece of the Atlantic Wall right out front. We also got to see some machines of war up close, like this C-47 that actually dropped paratroopers on D-Day. So today we're beginning our second part of the journey, and we're going to learn a little bit about the Homefront, what got the United States into the war, and tour an in-depth exhibit devoted to D-Day. So, at the onset of the war, it's no secret that the United States was not prepared at all. Not only was its army a much similar size to that of Portugal or Romania, the United States wasn't even considered a world power at the time. And just to put it in perspective, here you have the Japanese army at almost 1 million, the Nazi Germany army well over 3 million, and the United States at 335,000 military personnel. And here we have a few different variations of armbands and necklaces and other paraphernalia from various organizations. Some daggers, and here's a few closer look at some of those armbands here. These are always pretty fascinating, but I think what's the most fascinating is this little carbine here. And this carbine apparently is an Italian youth rifle. That's interesting. So this is something that's interesting as well. These German relief charity boxes were an attempt to lessen the division between the rich and the poor. And if you didn't donate, you'd be intimidated or lose your job. Here's a closer look at a few more decorative daggers here. This one's kind of gnarly. So you have an SS dagger and an SA dagger, which was a storm detachment apparently. Pretty interesting to see these up close. So here we have a timeline highlighting some of the events that would lead up to this deadly conflict. And here in 1938, they're discussing how Hitler sent troops to Austria to essentially restore order and establish a union between the two countries. And below that you have the appeasement in Munich, which in short was Hitler demanding the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and the United Kingdom and France would essentially appease Hitler's demands. And this incident here was called the Marco Polo incident, and that was essentially the Japanese provoking the Chinese into a full-scale war. And the title of this area says it best, A World in Flames. And I also wanted to share this with you. In 1938, Kristallnacht happened, and we commonly refer to it as the Night of Broken Glass. But this essentially kicked off the Holocaust, and within days, almost 30,000 Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. Seeing these always gives me a pretty eerie feeling, and if you don't know what they are, this is a British infant gas mask, so the infant would be fully encapsulated in that. And they have a few other different variations here. Here's a child's gas mask, and here's that. I just couldn't imagine having to put your child on one of these or inside one of these. Jeez. Oh wow, so this is pretty neat. This is obviously President Roosevelt addressing the nation, and it's a pretty cool hologram. This museum is packed full of immersive exhibits like this. So much like any war, usually the country's divided. You have people that want to intervene, and you have people that don't want anything to do with it at all. So you have the interventionalists versus the isolationists, essentially. It's often overlooked because you don't realize how divided the country was up until after Pearl Harbor, when the country was more unified than it ever was before. Here was a Gallup poll in September of '40, and you had 52% saying that the United States should risk going to war, 48% saying no. And in that same year, overwhelming support for stopping Japanese expansion, which is interesting. So here's a few draft-related items. This little capsule here, this was a draft capsule, and your service number is placed inside and enclosed in the capsule, and it was drawn in a lottery-type system. And if you were drawn, you were given these orders in the mail, and this is induction orders. And these would tell you where and when to report and what branch you were in. And here we have a news article just showing how close the war actually was to the United States. And this article is from September of '41. And now we're progressing to the Day of Infamy. And if you're into any sort of history, you know exactly what this phrase is referring to. And obviously the Day of Infamy is referring to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And here they're just showing you what the harbor would have looked like and all the locations of the ships. just how tightly bunched together they were. They did this because they thought that the ships would be easier to defend this way. So the Japanese didn't just wake up and decide to attack Pearl Harbor. You can see some of the events that would lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Beginning in 1936, 1937, you have Japanese expansion in China, and apparently on December 12th of 37, Japanese forces sank a river gunboat, the USS Panay, killing 2 and wounding 43. That's quite the escalation there. I didn't know that. And you can see some of the other events leading to the Day of Infamy. And as you can see, Admiral Yamamoto began planning the attack on Pearl Harbor almost a full year before the attack itself. And as you can see, tensions are rising. On October 31st of 1941, a German U-boat, U-552, sank the USS Reuben James with a loss of 115 lives. This is another incident that I didn't really know unfolded prior to the United States entering the war. And here's a few other events. The main body of the Japanese forces begins transit to Pearl Harbor. And on December 7th, they would launch their attack. So here's a few artifacts from that fateful day. This piece here, this was a floating compass from the USS California. And this guy here, apparently that's a letter opener, not a very tiny sword. And here's some currency. Someone drew on it, looks like. And this is by far the coolest. This section here is from the USS Arizona. Wow. There's another small piece of the USS Arizona that was recovered when they were constructing the memorial. And here's a closer look at that section. And something to note, over 2,300 U.S. service members lost their lives on the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, half of those came from the USS Arizona. So something that was pretty unfortunate during this time was the armed forces were highly segregated, and that wasn't always the case. From the first days of the Continental Navy through the end of the Civil War, African Americans can serve in any enlisted capacity in which they were qualified for. But unfortunately, after the American Civil War, which is kind of ironic, the Navy began to restrict African American service. Now, most African Americans in the Navy at this time would serve as messmen, and one of the most famous of those messmen was Dory Miller, who enlisted in the Navy as a mess attendant in 1939. Now, he'd be awarded a Navy Cross for his actions on December 7, 1941. Not only did he help get wounded soldiers to safety, he would man a machine gun until he was literally ordered to abandon ship. Now, Dory Miller would be reassigned to the USS Indianapolis since his ship was out of action, and on November 24, 1943, the Indianapolis was torpedoed, and unfortunately, Dory Miller was killed along with 600 of his shipmates. So you can see Dory Miller being awarded his Navy Cross in the background there, but this is a 50 caliber water-cooled machine gun, and this is what Dory Miller would have manned on the deck of the USS West Virginia. So by water-cooled machine gun, there was a jacket around the barrel that would have water in it, and as the gun fired, that water would keep the barrel cool. And I also wanted to point this out. Dory Miller manned a machine gun just like this one and successfully shot down a Japanese aircraft. Wow, so this 48-star flag was actually at Pearl Harbor, and it was on, let's see here, the USS St. Louis. Wow. So if you ever visit the World War II Museum, they're going to give you this card, and it's called a dog tag. And when you get to one of the designated scanning locations, once you scan it, it will give you your soldier's name, and ours is Robert Rosendahl. And it's going to tell you all about what this soldier did, where he fought, and it's going to let you know a little bit about his life as well. Making our way to the Arsenal of Democracy portion of the museum, and here we're going to learn a little bit about the Homefront and about D-Day. And we're approaching the Homefront portion and just going into how the war changed for everyday Americans. And wow, so they have what a normal household would look like in the early 40s or late 30s. And it's going into just some of the rationing that the normal American citizens had to do. And I think these open. Yep, yeah, here they do. And here's a few pieces of literature from that time period. They're also giving a few examples of some of the rationing here. So this fly swatter here, instead of being made from metal or steel, it was made out of wood. Huh. And a few other examples here. Let's see what this says. Frigidaire goes to war, known for its refrigerators and air conditioners, and it switched from manufacturing fridges to 50 caliber machine guns. It's quite the transition. And the shortages led to fewer canned goods. The need for military transportation meant cutbacks in fresh food shipments around the country. Wow. So if you had a family member serving, you would display this star flag in your window. And if the service member died in combat, a gold star would replace the blue one here. That's a nice little touch they added here. I like that. So earlier in the video, we saw just how unprepared the United States was for war, and you can see as the war progressed how our armed forces just continued to grow. And by 1945, almost 12 million service members. Jeez, this is a pretty cool room. This is an example of what a factory would have looked like during that time. This one's constructing Jeeps, and this portion of the museum is dedicated to the manufacturing efforts. And this is showing what companies started building when the war broke out. For example, Kodak, instead of cameras, they were building grenades. And RCA, instead of radios, they were building transmitting tubes. I'm not sure what those are for. Frigidaire, we saw there, instead of refrigerators, 50 caliber machine guns. And FMC, instead of piston pumps for pesticides, they were building LVTs. And Chrysler started building Shermans instead of vehicles. Truly an all-out effort. And here's a few more interactive boards here, so you can click on manufacturing, and it shows you all the companies that contributed to the war effort. So we'll click on Browning, and a story pops up, and this says Browning's 30 caliber machine gun was a fearsome weapon in the hands of a skilled rear seat gunner such as John Liska, and he was credited for being a rear seat ace, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft with his 30 calibers. Alright, looks like it's quiz time. What automatic weapon had the highest rate of fire of any machine gun fielded during World War II? So I want to say the MG42. I know it was called Hitler's buzzsaw. So I'm going to click MG42. And wow, I was wrong. Huh. So this is saying the 30 caliber machine gun had the highest rate of fire. Between 1,300 and 1,450 rounds per minute. I believe the MG42 was around 1,200. So lo and behold, the 30 caliber was the highest rate of fire. Here's another cool little interactive board. This is just showing you the munitions output by the American manufacturing. You can kind of see where we started at the attack of Pearl Harbor, and the invasion of North Africa is another benchmark. Italy should be coming Normandy. Yep, there it is. Wow, that's impressive. Now we're moving to a not so bright spot in our nation's history, but we need to tell this story as well. Unfortunately, after Pearl Harbor, a sense of fear and ignorance swept through the nation, and if you were a Japanese American, you were given 1 week to report to an internment camp. And over 110,000 Japanese Americans were forced into these camps along the West Coast. And here's some instructions to all Japanese ancestry living in the following areas. So I guess they would post these. And here's a Japanese American family looking at some graffiti, what I'm assuming is on one of their homes or businesses. And there were no exceptions. Jack Yoshihara was a defensive back for the Oregon State football team, and he was not allowed to travel. And his team would win the Rose Bowl, and he would not receive his ring until 1985 because he was in an internment camp during the game. Entering the D-Day portion of the Arsenals of Democracy, and we're about to see an example of the Telemetry Room. Now this thing here, this can see almost 15 miles out on the horizon. And so here's an example of the Telemetry Room, and this is pretty cool. I got the wife scanning the horizon for Allied ships, and yeah, so it's set up like a bunker, and you can see straight out. Looks like, you know, you have your ocean and beach there. This is pretty cool visual. Now I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming these numbers here are the degrees in which the rangefinder would be pointed. So I'm sure in conjunction with the degrees and range, this information would be passed along to the appropriate personnel and then passed along to the big guns to start hitting the targets on the horizon. Here they're just showing you some of the many examples of obstacles that the Allies would encounter here on D-Day. You can see with the that tide line there, a lot of these obstacles were underwater, which I wasn't really aware of. And here's a picture from one of the beaches here. And looks like there's a mine on a log there. Jeez, some of these seem so simple, but I mean they really did slow the Allies down. It's a pretty neat comparison between the two armies. You have a German infantryman on the left. This is what he would look like in 1944. And yeah, this is pretty cool. I always love seeing the comparison. And here's your U.S. infantryman in 1944, holding his M1 Garand. The German, his Kar 98, right there. And here's the famous gas mask on the chest in that black bag. And this thing right here, this is called a gas detection brassard. So I guess if the soldier came in close contact with the gas, it would change colors, at least in theory. Getting into some of the weapons that the attackers would have carried, and this shell, this is one of the naval artillery rounds that was fired before the landings here on D-Day, and they would weigh almost 3,000 pounds. And then just in comparison, the 75mm tank round from the Sherman was this little guy right here. So about the size of about half of a human leg, and you can see the naval round next to that uniform there. Well, it was over 6 feet tall. And here's your 82nd Airborne uniform. And here is a 60mm mortar, and let's get a closer look here. And here is the round that mortar would fire. Now they drop it into the top of that tube, and it would fire out. And here's your 30 caliber machine gun here, belt fed, and next to that is the 50 caliber. So here we have what was commonly called the bazooka. I believe they called it that because it looked like an instrument at that time, but the technical term is the M1 rocket launcher, and it had a range of 700 yards. Now here is my favorite weapon of World War II, and this is the Browning automatic rifle. And you can see it right here with the bipod, and right here is your M1 carbine, and above that's your M1 Garand with a grenade attachment. So it would fire a crimp cartridge and fire that grenade. And then here's your Thompson, and just above that was your grease gun, which was called that because it literally looks like a grease gun. I love these World War II weapons. And wrapping up with the American weapons here, you have your grenade, bayonet, and your Colt. And here's the German hand grenade, commonly called the potato masher. And here's Hitler's buzzsaw. This is your MG42, capable of firing 1,200 rounds a minute, and a very intimidating weapon. And here's a few other German weapons. Here is your Sturmgewehr, or commonly called the STG-44, and this is kind of the grandfather to the AK-47. So the Germans are pretty technologically advanced, and this is an example of that. So here's your standard anti-tank mine, and the correct name is the Telemetry 35, and right next to that you can see this is called a glass mine. And this glass mine right here, you could not detect that with a metal detector. And then right here is your bouncing Betty. So when you would step on that, it would shoot up to about waist level and then explode, causing maximum damage. And that wooden one there, that's a wooden box mine. Again, really hard to detect with a metal detector. So part of the success of D-Day can be attributed to the, I guess, espionage or deception efforts of the Allies. So they had to keep Hitler guessing, and they had to make sure that he did not think Normandy would be the invasion site. So they built a series of ghost armies, as you can say, that were made out of pretty much inflatables, and here's an example of that. This is crazy to me. It's literally an inflatable truck, life-size. I mean, I definitely need one of these to go to the pool next time I go. Wow. And here's a Sherman. You can see 4 soldiers literally just picking it up. But the cool thing is, from the air, you could not tell of this. So to the Germans, this looked like a real tank. And commanding this fictitious army was no other than Patton himself. Okay, so this is cool. This is an Enigma machine. And this was developed by the Germans, and it was used to transmit classified information, and this had over 200 trillion possible combinations. Well, unbeknownst to the Germans, the Allies were able to crack this code. Alright, so here's another cool piece, and if you've ever watched The Longest Day, you know exactly what this is, and if you haven't, this is called a Rupert. and it was D-Day's smallest soldier, so they would drop these out of C-47s during the paratrooper landings to hopefully confuse the Germans. Wow, so this is really cool. So the Allied airborne forces didn't just come in on C-47s. Some units came in on these, and these are gliders. And they would be towed by C-47s and released over their drop zones, and they would, in theory, glide in to their landing zone. And one of the most famous attacks utilizing gliders was the attack on Pegasus Bridge. Well, unfortunately, they were lightly armed and really susceptible to damage. Here's a few images after the gliders have landed. Some of them can even carry vehicles and small anti-tank guns. And here's one that crashed with a fallen U.S. soldier. But here is a life-size version of one of these gliders. And the craziest thing about these gliders is you can see they hold vehicles, but they're made out of simply plywood and canvas. That just blows my mind that you would ride this into combat. So at the time, airborne units were considered specialized, so they had specialized uniforms, and they also had weapons that were altered to fit their needs. This here's M1 carbine with a foldable stock as opposed to the stock we saw earlier, so this would help save the paratrooper room. And here is a knife with some brass knuckles fitted to it. God, that thing is gnarly looking. And here is your famous cricket. Soldiers would click this, and hopefully the clicks returned were by friendly soldiers. Moving into some of the images from the beach landings from that fateful and famous day. Some of these I've never seen before, and so that's pretty interesting to see. And here's some of the realities from that day. A fallen soldier next to a German bunker. And here's one of the more iconic images from D-Day that most of us have seen. Gosh, I just don't know how they did it. Here's a pretty powerful image. The rifles arranged in a cross-like formation next to a fallen soldier who never made it off of Omaha Beach. So this image here is from Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division. And when they'd hit Omaha Beach, they'd have 170 men, and within the first 10 minutes, 155 of these men were killed or wounded. So this is Navy Corpsman Leo H. Shear, and he served in the 7th Naval Beach Battalion, which was attached to the 6th Engineer Special Brigade on D-Day. And this is his utility belt that he would hit the beach with. Wow. I love these personal artifacts like this. And this helmet here, well, it was worn by Ed Nelson, who was a corpsman in a beach evacuation party at Utah Beach. He also wore these dog tags and personal first aid kit on that day. Wow. Here's his personal first aid kit, his tags, and the very helmet that he wore. It's also important to remember that the Americans weren't the only ones that stormed the beaches. British and Canadian forces hit the beaches as well. And you can see the seawall here on Juno Beach, which would present quite the obstacle, along with the shattered town in the background. Wow, this is a pretty cool image to see. I've never seen it before. So once the Allies hit the beaches and established the beachhead, you now have to push inland. And they became bogged down in this maze-like structure called hedgerows in the French countryside. And here's one of the examples of the hedgerows. This is pretty high, at least 15 feet. And these were quite the defenses here. You can see the Germans really fortified these hedgerows here. And here you have a barrel of a MG34 maybe? It's hard to tell. But this really bogged down the Allies after the beach landings. And here is an example of a U.S. soldier kneeling next to one of these hedgerows here. And this is pointed right at my chest, which is not a comforting feeling. And here's another one here. Gosh, just obstacle after obstacle taking back France. Boggles my mind. And here is PFC Joseph K. Barno's battle-damaged helmet. Now this soldier received several wounds via shrapnel, but this bullet that struck his helmet, it exited out the other side, and he had no wounds from this. That's incredible.